So, hi guys, our topic is about nationalism. So, what is nationalism? Nationalism came from the French word nationalisme, an earlier word for devotion or strong attachment to one's own country. Earlier, it was used in the theological sense of the doctrine of divine election of nations. In 1844, it connotes as devotion to one's country, national spirit or aspirations, desires for national unity, independence, or prosperity. So, what is nationalism as an ideology? Nationalism is an ideology based on the premises that individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpass other individual or group interests. It promotes a nation's interests, especially in maintaining and gaining nation's sovereignty over its homeland. It holds the principle of the nation should govern itself free from outside interference, and that the nation is a natural and a equal source of political power.
Nationalists, the one who believe or acknowledge the concept of nationalism, believe that their nation is superior to all other, but most often this sense of superiority has been roots of the shared ethnicity. So, kung susumahin, ang mga nationalist, ang mga personalidad o individual na naniniwala sa konsepto ng nationalism. Naniniwala sila na ang kanilang estado ay higit sa lahat o may potential na maging higit sa lahat dahil ang bawat estado ay mga natatanging kayamanan at base lamang ito sa kung paano hawakan ng mga tao mismo doon o mga lokal na mamamayan doon. Ang mga nationalists ay nagde-demand ng kalayaan sa ibang bansa. Hindi nila gusto na sumali sa mga global organization dahil inano nila na ang estado ay kayang gumalaw ng pansarili o kayang mag-act as one or alone na hindi kinakailangan ng tulong ng ibang bansa kung makahandle mo ito ng maayos. Then, ang nationalism, ini-invoke niya ang self-governing state o para kung isusuma natin sa ideolohiya at dadagdag natin sa mismong konsepto ng pagpapatakbo ng isang estado, magiging self-governing state siya. Nakafocus sila sa lahat ng aspeto ng ekonomiya para ma-promote ang national interest ng kanilang bansa at ma-achieve nila yung self-governing state. Kasi hindi ka maging successful ang nationalism if hindi mo kaya sustentuhan ang sarili mong estado. Kaya dito, may mga polisiya sila na pinagtitibay ang mga produksyon ng pangsarili lamang nila. Isa na dito yung capital goods, natural resources, entrepreneurship, and labor. And then yung lahat nito tumatakbo sa domestic industries. Like yung mga capital goods, yung mga goods nila, then mga raw materials, natural resources na pwede ng pagkuha ng mga raw materials, entrepreneurship na pag-innovate ng isang produkto na pwede nilang ibenta. Then, labor, ang trabaho para sa mga lokal na mamamayan nila. Ang nationalism ay merong polisiya nakabase sa protectionism. Ano nga bang protectionism? Itong usang uri ng teorya na parang shield niya or dinedepensahan niya yung self-owned country domestic industries from global competition through taxing imports. So sa ganitong bagay, ang protectionism is sinasubsidize niya yung domestic industries, local domestic industries nila na in-specialize mismo ng national interest ng kanilang bansa. So, ang nangyari dito, ang protectionism ay mas tinatasan nila yung mga tariffs and quotas na foreign imports na magkukuha dito para magkaroon ng price imbalance. Automatic, pag mataas ang quota tariffs ng isang foreign imports, mas mataas ang presyo nito. Kaya mas tataas ang demand ng mga local domestic industries products at magiging demand ito sa merkado. Alam natin noon na may mga bansa talaga na hindi ganong kayaman at hindi pinaprioritize ang ekonomiya para sa national interest. Pinapriority nila ang ang ekonomiya para sa military forces lamang. At yun yung most likely na ginagamit nila.
So, notable nationalists in the history. First is Adolf Hitler, Jair Bolsonaro, Khaled Mashal, Benito Mussolini, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Camille Benso, Count de Cavour, Yasser Arafat, Sun Yat-sen, Giuseppe Mazzini, Gabriel Dumont. So, you may be confused about this notable nationalists in the history because they are related to other political ideologies such as fascism and socialism. But we included, or they are notable nationalists in the history because they are promote their nation, the interest of their nation, especially when it comes of the unification of their nation. Adolf Hitler is one of the great example of that because Adolf Hitler is the one of the great promoter of German nationalism, but in an extreme manner. So, what are the relation of nationalism in the World War I? So, nationalism was a prominent force in early 20th century Europe and the significant cause of World War I. Nationalists exaggerate the importance of virtues of their home country, placing its interests above those of other nations. In 19th and early 20th century, many Europeans, particularly citizens of so-called great powers Britain, France, and Germany, had convinced themselves of the cultural and economical and military supremacy of other nations. Nationalism also correlates with the imperialism because of these three great countries that really wanted to colonize or to take over the supremacy in other nations. They felt that they have the superiority in other nations in terms of economic, military, and cultural. So, what is Balkan nationalism? Balkan nationalism is also relates with the outbreak of World War I, because Pan-Slavism is a belief of Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe should have their own nation, was a powerful force in the region. Slavs is the one of the powerful in the Eastern Europe. Slavic nationalism was strongest in Serbia, where it had risen significantly in the late 19th and 20th century. Pan-Slavism was particularly to oppose the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its control and influence over the region. Austro-Hungarian Empire was an alliance of Germany. That's why it also having the superiority in other nations. These groups hope to drive Austria-Hungary from the Balkans and establish a greater Serbia, a unified state of all Slavic people. It was an Pan-Slavic nationalism that inspired the assassination of Archduke Franz in Sarajevo in June 1914, an event that led directly to outbreak of World War I. So the Germany alliance of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is the one that influenced greatly in the region of Balkans, and these Slavic people revolt to this Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the presumptive heir of the Empire of Austro-Hungarian was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So by his assassination, the started a war against the Pan-Slavic or Slavic people. Because the one that initiate or influence the Austro-Hungarian Empire was its alliance, Germany, to have a war or start the World War One, to show who has have the great influence towards the region, or who has a supremacy in terms of economic, cultural, and other.
African nationalism. So, isang bagay na nakaapekto ang nationalism dahil sa European invasion noon or sa pananakop ng mga European noong unang panahon. Isa na naapektuhan dito is ang Africa at na-influential na sila ng African nationalism. So, babanggitin ko lang po ang brief history. So, in early 19th century, the European power divided the continent, ruled virtually all of Africa, and African lost their sovereignty. So, noong unang panahon, hinati ng mga European ang buong Africa. Although lahat to is parang independent state ng Africa noon at hindi united, hinati nila ang continent at para mahawakan nito ng maayos ang buong Africa. Isa na dito is ang South Africa and West Africa. Then hinati-hati nila para mahawakan nila na maayos. In mid-19th century, while Africa began seriously resist colonialism, parang nasasanay na sila na hawakan ng at na medyo matagal na ang colonial rule or parang napipigilan nila. Africa makes a major transformation that attained their freedom and regained their sovereignty. Kahit papaano nakakuha nila yung kanilang freedom at ang kanilang sovereignty. Ngunit hindi ito absolute, like parang handle pa rin sila ng mga European, pero meron silang freedom and sovereignty. Dito na pumasok ang Pan-Africanism. Dahil noon sa imbalance sa pag-handle noon, pumasok tong Pan-Africanism. Ito ay ang principle or advocacy of political union of all indigenous inhabitants of Africa. Ito yung parang advokasya ng kailangan na i-invoke ng mga Afrikano para maano nila ang kanilang karapatan, like karapatan na mabuhay, karapatan maging maayos at tamang pamamahala, kasi talagang napaka imbalance sa mga African at unfair yon sa kanila. Ito yung pinakamalaking movement ng mga African nationalists dahil naging global ito. Mamaya ako sabihin kung bakit naging global. Pero naging matunog to dahil nagkaroon nito ng connection at naging pangmalawakan talaga, as in global talaga. Ang two proponents sa Pan-Africanism si Marcus Garvey and si W.E.B. Du Bois. Si W.D. Du Bois, nag-aral siya mismo, isa siyang scholar na nag-aral mismo sa Africa. Si Marcus Garvey, siya ay nag-research naman tungkol sa Africa. Then, yun nga, dumating yung Great Depression at malaking ang naging epekto nito sa Africa at nag-improve lalo ang poverty. So, yun nga, nag-improve ang poverty dahil sa Great Depression. Ngunit ang totally may hawak ng power isang European. Ngunit ang European ay nakafocus lamang sa development ng mga machinery o combat development, at ang research at attention nila ay nakapokus sa World War II, which is naging imbalance at parang hindi makatarungan yun para sa mga African kasi sila yung mga labor, sila yung mga manggagawa, sila yung ngunit di sila napapakinggan, di sila nasusolusyonan dahil sa kahirapan nila noon. Netong 1940s, ang nationalist movement become more radical and Africans everywhere began to protest colonial rule as they increasingly realized how wrong and oppressive it was. So, sa sobrang oppressive nila, parang sobrang sila magpatrabaho, sobrang sila magpaano. Dahil sa preparation nila doon sa World War II, hindi nila iniisip ang poverty at wala silang pakialam doon. Then, ang nangyari, ang mga nationalist movements o yung mga act ng mga nationalist, naging mas aktibo sila at mas bahagyan lumawak ang mga protesta laban sa colonial rule. At doon na medyo naging nakilala na itong Pan-Africanism. Then nitong World War II, after World War II, naging manggagawa sila at naging sundalo ng mga European sa World War II. At na-expect ang mga African na mabibigyan sila ng reward as para mabigyan sila ng tamang kalayaan. At yun ang nangyari, na-expect sila, ngunit hindi nila natin yung na-expect nila na pinauwi sila, binano sila, at nag-continuous pa rin yung ganung sistema. At ang pinakamahirap dito is hindi nila naibalik yung ekonomiya at in-stable nila sa weak economy. Although nabawasan nila yung ekonomiya dahil sa preparation ng World War II, ginamit ng mga resources nila ng World War II. At ang nangyari is hinayaan nila at hindi sila nag-isip ng increasement. Kaya ang mga African ay naging disconnected at bitter sa colonial government dahil sa hindi matarungan nilang ginawa sa kanilang colonial state. In 1945, dahil sa ganung sistema na pangyayari, dahil nag-improve na mga slavery at naging increase ng criminal rate dahil sa kahirapan at mahinang ekonomiya ng bansang yon, ang mga Pan-African Manchester Congress in England, inattempt nila na mag-address yung pangailangan ng mga blacks. Or, noong unang panahon, ang tawag kasi sila lang yung parang native blacks or pure blacks people. Then, sinubukan nilang i-attain yung pangailangan ng mga blacks kasi talagang naghihirap na sila doon at talagang pabagsak ng ibang lugar doon sa Africa. Then, doon nangyari dahil alam nila na napapakinggan sila at nakikita nila yung hinaing nila. Naging aktibo na naman tong Pan-Africanism movement and dahil alam nila na nakikita ng mga tao ang sitwasyon ng mga black sa Africa na nagkakaroon ng parang hindi makatarunang bagay. Then in 1950s, dahil nga doon sa pangyayari ngayon, yung mga leader ng ibang lugar sa Africa ay na-impluwensya na ng Pan-Africanism. Isa din si Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, then si Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Albert Lutuli of South Africa, and Nandi Azikiwe ng Nigeria. So, parang ito yung parang, hindi kasi united na ng Africa, as in, like parang tribe sila, per baluarte ang nangyayari sa kanila. Kaya madali silang malusob, madali silang masakop, kasi walang unity dun sa kanila. Then, ang nangyari dahil sa pag-improve ng ganito, ang Pan-Africanism, ni-reinforce niya ang notion of black pride. Parang inano niya ang rights ng black pride. Kaya ang nangyari, talagang mas naging boom to. Parang halos lahat ng tao sa mundo is parang ina-advocate nila na native black, kayo, parang African descent kayo. So, kasali kayo dito. Kaya naging parang radical talaga sa buong mundo tong Pan-Africanism. Then, dahil sa sa mga previous movements, nag dahil sa nationalism thinking ng mga African, pati yung women empowerment, nag-rise din kasi malaki ang contribution nila sa pag-resist ng colonial rule and promotion ng nationalism. Like for example, like kakaroon na kasi nung unang panahon ng pag-uusap ng ibang mga baluarte dun sa or lalawigan dun sa Africa. Then, ang nangyari, parang ang mga women, nanguna rin sila sa pag-promote ng nationalism sa mga sa pag-set ng mindset ng mga tao. At lumaban din sila. Naging may mga general din na babae. Lumaban din sila para ipagtanggol yung kanilang estado. Then, sa tagal ng panahon, ay naging successful ang nationalism. Then, overfall nila yung colonial oppressor. O parang na-overflow nila, sinakain nila yung mga mananakop na dahil pinaglalaban nila yung karapatan ng estado nila at karapatan nila doon sa estado nila. Then, maintain nila yung unity kahit hindi nila na-acquire yung absolute independence. So, kahit papaano, nagkakaroon na pa rin ng hawak pa rin sila ng European. Pinaiting nila yung pagkakaisa nila dahil hiwa-hiwalay kasi sila kaya madali silang Then, kahit hindi nila kuha pa yung absolute independence, kahit papaano, maintain nila yung unity nila. At, yun, may laban na sila. Then, the pan-Africanism more likely became broad-based mass movement. So, parang naging malaki ang movement na to. Dahil sa pag-impluensya ng isang bansa sa isang bansa, sa mga liderato ng bawat bansa, sa pag-uusap nila at pagkakaisa, naging pangmalakihang movement na siya at naging mas nagkaroon ng magandang pagsasama ang mga native at hindi lang ito naging local at naging international din ito. After 2 decades of war, they enjoyed their greatest success as an international liberation movement. So, naging international liberation movement in 20 years and parang mas nag-improve na sila at nasosuppress na nga yung mga oppressor at nagiging mas matibay na yung pagkasama nila kaya nagkaroon ng enjoyment kahit papano. At muntikan nila makuha agad sana ang kanilang independence dahil sa Cold War din. Then sa Cold War din, nagkaroon ng struggle. Maatay na dapat nila. Then, pasuko na rin ng mga ang colonial government dahil nagkakaisa na ang bansang Africa. Ngunit, dahil sa Cold War, parang hinubog nito yung medyo struggle o banta doon sa independence ng Africa. Dahil lang, kung titignan natin, nagkaroon ng Cold War between West and East. Then, ang Africa is parang nasa gitna siya. So, parang pwede siyang daungan o dampuan ng mga ganun. So, it is advantage sa bawat bansa kung makuha mo ang Africa kasi napakalaking bansa nito at malaking advantage to para manalo ka doon sa Cold War man yun o sa kanong war na yun. Ngunit si Nkrumah of Ghana, hindi in-emphasize niya yung African unity and iniwasan niya ang pagpili ng sides o pagpanig sa East and West War. Iniwasan niya yun kasi nationalist mindset siya. If ever wala siyang pakialam sa away nyo. Ang kailangan ko dito, independence through unity ng aking bansa. Bala kayo dyan. Parang ganun sinasabi niya. Then, in 1957, nagkaroon ng All-African People Conference. Nangyari siya noon, in 1957, kung saan in-emphasize nila ang Pan-Africanism at kung anong way, kung paano magiging sistema ng Africa kapag nag-unite sila, kung paano nila maintain yung independence nila. Diyan nila pinag-uusapan nila in All African People. Then, in 1963, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, established. So, ayan ang tinatawag ngayon in modern is African Union, AU. Ito yung parang basis ng magsasama ng isang bansa na binase nila na parang United Nations. Parang United Nation in Africa area. Parang ganun po ang nangyari. So, proceed naman tayo sa American nationalism. In 18th century, the British settlers that living in the northern part of America influences by Puritan Revolution. What is Puritan Revolution? Ito ang mga movement ng mga Puritans na kung saan kinokontradict nila ang mga Christian influences na hinahango na ang politika at ang simbahan ay magkasama. Then, yun nga, ang mga Puritans sa mga extreme Protestants na galing din sa European churches. Then, anong nangyari? Na-impluwensya nila mga British settlers sa northern part ng Amerika. Then, ang mga British settlers na-impluwensyahan din ng mga French philosopher sa pagbibigay ng mga makabagong interpretasyon at pagkakaunawa tungkol sa English liberty and the ideas of John Locke. Yun nga dito, parang dito nila na ang pagiging nationalist nila or nationalism nila dahil sa idea ni John Locke all about nationalism. After becoming a nation, they always engage in fight for individual rights and liberty. Ito nga yung na parang nasasakop na sila noon ng Europe. At yun ang nangyari. Mapapatayan man, ipaglalaban nila ang kanilang individual rights and liberty. Na kung saan nilalaban nila hanggang sa huli sa ngalan ng kalayaan. And bumabase sila sa political thoughts expressed by Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. Si Thomas Jefferson, naging presidente siya ng United States and siya ang principal author ng Declaration of Independence ng United States. So para sa kanya, ang kalayaan talaga is nararapat sa bawat bansa. Parang yun lang ang pinakapunto niya. Then si Thomas Paine, meron siyang dalawang pamphlet. Isa dito ay The Common Sense and The American Crisis, na kung saan nag-udyok sa mga American patriots para ma-attain yung independence sa Great Britain. Nang-engage yun sa kanila ng parang influence sa kanila para magpatuloy at ma-attain yung independence na kailangan na hinahangad nila. Dito na umiikot yung liberal and humanitarian nationalism. Ang liberal or civic nationalism is a form of nationalism that adheres the traditional liberal values of tolerance, equality, individualism, and freedom. So parang mas general to as a individual or sinatawag na civil rights or lahat ng kalayaan na pwedeng makaapekto sa mga mamamayan or mapa-individual man ay dapat na-attain yun. It is a traditional liberal values, parang traditional, makalumang pagkakaintindi ng nationalism. Then, humanitarian nationalism is a form of nationalism that focuses or seeks for humanity, aid, and welfare. So, parang pang sangkatauhan na to or parang pangmalakihan na. So, parang inaano nila is etong dalawang to ay dapat nag-e-exist sa bansang Amerika or sa depende man sa kung anong nasyon nila. Then the full forms of nationalism are used to for vanguard of humankind of USA. So parang mas ini-invoke nila yung humanitarian rights or karapatan ng mamamayan or human rights para mas nagaano dahil ito rin ang nagsisilbi nilang weapon para ma-attain yung Declaration of Independence to maintain the mindset of their constituent na pwede nilang maging weapon para ma-depensahan ang kanilang kalayaan. And in 18th founded that Declaration of Independence and the right of nation of America. Doon na nabuo ang United States of America in 18th century. Mapapasang hanggang ngayon ay di pa rin napapalitan. At magandang takbo na ngayon dahil naging akma sa kanila ang ganitong sistema dahil ito ay nababagay din sa kanila talaga as in.
Asian nationalism began to appear in Asia after World War I. Nationalism has been used in Asia as elsewhere to mobilize support for the development of a new nation-state or the revitalization of existing ones. Targets such as national self-determination, social and economic growth, the protection of territorial integrity or territorial extension, and supremacy over other nations have also been enabled. Like other nationalism, in order to establish a sense of collective identity, intention, and duty, Asian nationalism have deployed historical memories and myths belief in a shared race ties to a territorial homeland. The progress of nationalism in Asia and Africa is reflected in the histories of the League of Nations after World War I and of the United Nations after World War II. Communism recruited supporters from within the ranks of the new nationalist movement in Asia and Africa. First, by helping them in the struggles against Western capitalist power, and later, after independence was achieved, by completing with Western capitalism and extending financial and technical aid. Now, let's go to European nationalism. European nationalism, the first full manifestation of modern nationalism occurred in 17th century England in the Puritan Revolution. Nationalism grew in the 19th century as a result of Enlightenment thinking about equality, freedom, and democracy. And nationalism is a belief that people who have something in common can unite in such a way that it produces a cohesive and lasting state such as language, culture within the same place. Nationalism is linked to patriotism. Nationalism and patriotism, they're similar, but there's a difference between them. Anyway, and it is the guiding force behind a culture's identity. Since 1815, the Congress of Vienna and beyond, nationalism has had many effects in Europe. In a way, nationalism brings people together and people can feel that they belong to something. Yan. The rise of nationalism in Europe initiated with the Spring of Nations in 1848. According to Leon Baradat, nationalism calls on people to identify with the interests of their national group and to support the creation of a nation state, to support those interests. Nationalism was the ideological impetus that, in a few decades, transformed Europe. Ruled by monarchies and foreign control of territory,
was replaced by self-determination and newly formed national government. Oceania's nationalism is a group of political ideologies that emphasize the needs of the Oceania people in Lovia. There is no clear definition of Oceania nationalism, as there are many different kinds of explanation, from simply stating that there does exist Oceania culture, theories, such. Now let's move on to Australian nationalism. Australian nationalism asserts that the Australians are the nations and promotes the national and cultural unity of Australia. Australian nationalism has a history dating back to the late 19th century as Australia gradually developed a distinct culture and identity from that of Britain. Okay. Beginning to view itself as a unique and separate entity and not simply an extension or a derivation of British culture and identity. British imperialism was a significant driver of this nationalism, with Britain eager for the Australian colonies to consolidate in order to better cement British influence in the South Pacific.